Murder. The unlawful killing of another living, breathing human being. Or, as was the case on April 19, 1995, on a cool, crisp spring morning in downtown Oklahoma City, 168 living, breathing human beings. On this season of A Murderous Design, we'll study what may be the largest circumstantial evidence trial ever heard in an American courtroom, the United States of America versus Timothy James McVeigh. Based on the authentic trial transcripts and interviews with those who tried the case, we will uncover the author responsible for the formation and execution of A Murderous Design. I'm Brandon Birmingham. This is Timothy James McVeigh versus the USA. The self-described lunch bucket lawyer from Indiana put on 26 total witnesses during the trial and was chiefly responsible for the Bridges calling card and the very clever and impactful demonstrative aid matching Robert D. Kling's signature to McVeigh's handwritten notes. He delivered part of the closing arguments on behalf of the government of the United States, the victims, and their families. He was nice enough to sit down with me and share his experiences, and I'll share them with you. From volunteering for the trial team to relocating to Denver for the trial, please welcome Mr. Larry Mackey to A Murderous Design. Why don't you introduce yourself, and we'll go from there.
All right. Good afternoon. I'm Larry Mackey. I'm a lunch bucket lawyer from Indiana. I've finished 46 years of practice, but along the way, for almost 20 years, I was a federal prosecutor here in Indiana. The last 20 plus years in private practice.
Tell me what you mean by lunch bucket. I love that.
It's true to my profession. You've got to go to work every day, and you're on the hunt for something. Certainly, as a prosecutor, was evidence to support guilty convictions where deserved. As a defense lawyer, it's the hunt for facts that might mitigate and serve the purpose of the client. So it's always been a phrase that I think is true for a lot of lawyers, me in particular.
Well, you've led an extraordinary career, first of all, and the reason why I'm talking to you, obviously, is the Timothy McVeigh case. I don't know how it comes to be that you get assigned to, at the time, was the biggest case in the history of the United States of America. I mean, it was an extraordinary event. How did you find out you were going to work on the case, and walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah. So the bombing, of course, happened in April of 1995, and at that time I had served about 15 years as a federal prosecutor, much of which was here in Indianapolis, Indiana. At that time, we still used machines called teletypes, and we got a teletype saying, if anyone would like to possibly assist in responding to this national crime, let us know. And so I simply sent my letter of interest and got a phone call and was invited to Main Justice in Washington, D.C. I was interviewed by the DAG, the number 2 in charge of the department, Merrick Garland, whose name has been mentioned more than once recently.
Right.
To the interview, I was telling him about my interest, happy to serve in any role I could. And he said, well, we're really looking for the lead prosecutor. And I said, you don't want me. First of all, you want somebody from Oklahoma, if possible. This was the crime that affected their community. I told him that I would be a great second chair. I'd be a great chief of staff. Merrick told me later, he said, when you said that, we knew you should be number 1. As it turned out, Joe Hartzler, a dear friend of mine who I'd known, was a prosecutor first in Chicago and later in Central Illinois, where I had practiced, became the lead prosecutor. He called me up one day and said, Larry, they're killing me. I need some help. I said, I'm on the plane tomorrow. And he said, Larry, you'll only do the grand jury. You'll be home in 3 months. Your job will simply be to marshal the evidence for the grand jury, return the indictment, and you'll go home. I went home in 3 years. Joe left after the first case, so he's not such a good future teller.
Right, that's right. Well, tell me about your expectations and your thoughts. When you realized, okay, this is going to be my case.
Yeah, it's Well, I'll tell you the most vivid memory, of course, is I'm like everybody else in the summer of 1995, horrified by what had happened in Oklahoma City, and joined the many who had great concerns about whether this was a single act versus a series of acts that may come. So all of us as a people were still on edge at that time. But I remember getting off the plane and going to Oklahoma City downtown to see the bombing site, and it was still very, very raw. The fences were still up, the letters, the flowers, everything that people had left behind were there. And it can't help but freeze you. That moment in time is a reminder of what harm, Tim McVeigh and Terry Nichols had done. 168 people, 19 children killed on April 19th, 1995. And, that was my mission.
Well, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I'm just curious. Have you been back?
Oh, many times. Yes, of course. Yeah. The fast forward, of course, they built a wonderful museum. They have a memorial on the site where the bombing took place, and then a very impactful museum that's right there in the grounds. The bombing took place really in between at the Murrah Federal Building, so it took a block. The memorial has these huge stone structures. At the top one, it says 901. The other one says 903 because the bomb went off at 902. And at the memorial, they have 168 chairs of different sizes to represent the children with the victims' names. It's a very, very moving place. And inside the museum, people should go if for no other reason than they've captured sort of the moment of the bomb. If you're a visitor to the museum, you're ushered into this room with your fellow persons. Some you may know, some you don't. And the doors close and you're all standing there in the dark. And then at that moment in time, they begin to play a tape recording made by a lawyer, a woman named Lou Claver, who was across the street from the bomb at the time it went off. She's conducting an administrative hearing about some dispute on water rights in Oklahoma, and she's recording it. And so she starts by explaining that in America, to solve disputes, you get the parties together and evidence is gathered and people have a chance to make their arguments. And then the bomb goes off and you hear her and others screaming. And of course, the rest is history. In the museum, when the bomb goes off and you hear this sound, the doors open and you walk into this reconstruction of what it was like the moment the bomb went off downtown Oklahoma City. Lou Claver was our first witness in both the McVeigh and the Nichols case. And the jurors heard that very same recording that visitors to the museum hear today.
It was extraordinary to read the transcript. You've been nice enough to send me a copy of that, and I did hear that at the museum, and it is extraordinary. And that was, as you said, your very first witness.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, when we talk to law students, when we talk to college classes, anyone who of interest, we talk about this, dire dichotomy between justice being done in the way that we respect by people getting together to solve disputes and across the street, an act of terrorism that was until 9/11, the single worst on our soils.
Well, that's exactly right. Okay, let's go forward now and talk about the trial. This is, as near as I can tell, the largest circumstantial evidence type case, and given the scope and the breadth ever in the history of an American courtroom that was ever tried to a jury. You were, had a significant role. Tell me, just going into the trial, what did you feel like were your stronger pieces of evidence, and how did you decide when and how to deal with those in front of the jury?
Yeah, great question, because your description is absolutely precise. I mean, it's literally mountains of evidence, and we can talk in detail. But to answer your question more precisely, we, over time, the bombing prosecutors put together a little motto, hung it up in the war room that says, don't bury the story with the evidence. This really was a case where you could go on too long on many propositions of fact that you wanted to prove. What was important is to figure out our story. What is the best evidence that would serve to convince a lay jury of guilt, and then ultimately justification for the death penalty? And so that was the theme from the beginning. And frankly, some of the hardest decisions we made was what evidence to leave back in the war room and not bring to the courtroom.
That's always the trick, I would imagine, in different scales. But, you want to put forth enough, but you don't want, to bore the jurors. And you certainly might want to save something for rebuttal. Sometimes lawyers consider that. You started out with Lou Claver to sort of set the scene, I suppose. Then you had some victims come forward and describe their journeys, unfortunately, identify the bodies and the dead, and you go from there. And tell me your role. What was going into it at that point? Did you want jurors to know about? How were you going to try this case against Timothy McVeigh?
Yeah, the opening is really, obviously, as all openings do, attempt to outline what the prosecution intends to do. And it really was, in my mind, largely identifying who was responsible, just simply answering the question, who did this? And then more importantly, or certainly equally important, was why. Because people cannot come to grasp why, anyone would want to smash a 9-month-old child to their death. And to do so with such, blind ignorance to the harm and the suffering that would be created. To your point about managing the victim's witnesses, for example, there were scores and scores of witnesses that we could have put on the stand, and we chose a fashion where we would bring one, no more than two, from each of the affected agencies. So the Murrah building was a community. It was a city, and inside you had Social Security, you had ATF, and you had the credit union. It was a family. It was definitely a family, and so we had representatives of those families come in and tell the jury with diagrams. Here's my office. Here's where I was sitting at the time the bomb went off, and then they would simply identify where their coworkers were lost. And so in that fashion, tell the jury about the scope of the crime, but not bring everybody in who was there at the same time. So that was one thing that we did in particular. But to answer your fundamental question, really was all about proving who did it and why.
You mentioned in your closing argument, one that I think a lesson that I know has been sort of lost over the ages. It seems like I don't hear this phrase anymore, but motive means an opportunity. You talked about how, basically did McVeigh have the motive to do this, and did he have the means to do it? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so absolutely. Let me start at the ground zero, so to speak, because the truth of the matter is there was nobody on the face of the earth who could credibly identify Tim McVeigh as a person who's jumped out of his U-Haul truck after he lit the fuse and ran away. Even though there were lots of interviews and lots of people saw people of Middle Eastern descent jumping out of that truck. But, the truth is we had no on-the-ground ID of anybody known Tim McVeigh at that time. And so, frankly, as I've often said, the single best or the single most important piece of evidence in this case fell out of the sky. Because on April 19th, when the bomb went off, down the street, about a block and a half, was a large residential tower. And a guy named Richard Nichols was coming out just as the bomb went off. And his car with a family member was sitting out front. It was a youngster that he was going to take to a doctor. And just instinctively, of course, he raced to try to shield his child. And he's standing there waiting for the bomb blast to pass. And he hears this sound. He described it like a helicopter going whoosh, 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 getting louder and louder. And then eventually it crashes on his car. So the good news is it was at the front of the car. They were at the rear of the car. So neither were seriously injured. But that projectile was a 300-pound axle off the bomb truck. And that was the start of the trail to find out who caused the blast. Because as everyone knows, there's a VIN number, and often in vehicles, it's more than one place. And in this case, it was right on the axle. And so immediately we traced it back to Junction City, Kansas. And that was the first step in identifying the answer to the question, who did this?
And it was Robert Kling, right?
Yeah, it led to Yeah, led us to a not so impressive body shop in Junction City, Kansas, run by a guy named Eldon Elliott.
He did have a funny T-shirt. I did remember reading that. We never forget our customer or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But yes,
so the phone call.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. So the phone call goes to the resident agency in Salina, Kansas, closest to Junction City. This is critical. So they call Elliott's, the FBI agent does, and says, I'm coming over there. Want to talk about this incident. Do not talk about this with anyone. And of course, everybody's talking about it. So by the time the agent arrives, they all have their own theories about who it was that might have rented the bomb truck. The truth be told, this gives birth to the famous John Doe 2 story.
Okay.
We have the single best witness, a guy named Tom Kessinger, who was the mechanic sitting in the room at the time McVeigh rented the bomb truck, had this phenomenal recall for physiques. And as the portrait artist said when they gave his descriptions, the guy had a great command of details of people. He described two people, not one. He described McVeigh to a T, but he described a guy named Michael Herding who had come in the second day and also rented a bomb truck. He'd taken two events, merged them into one, but thus gave birth to John Doe 2. The reason I mention this, of course, is in the courtroom, we know what jurors think about ID testimony. It is suspect for good reason, doesn't always have a good track record. So we knew from the beginning that we would not be putting on anyone from Eldon Elliott's U-Haul store to identify Tim McVeigh. Instead, what we did was we went another route and said, well, show us a rental agreement. And that's where we learned that the bomb truck was rented by a person representing himself to be Robert D. Kling. In fact, presented a South Dakota driver's license with a date of birth of April 19th. And also the city was Redlands, as in blood, Redlands, South Dakota. I mean, McVeigh went to great length to sort of story and more about that, but he signed the signature Robert D. Kling. We tested the document for fingerprints, no luck. We got a pretty good hit on the handwriting, but we were unable to offer that testimony at trial. So we can talk more about how we solved that problem. But that's really where the identification proof began, was right there at the checkout counter for the bomb truck.
Okay. Well, let's stay with that. Let's stay with this piece of evidence. Okay. You've got a receipt from Eldon Elliott's shop there, and it says Robert D. Kling, I think, and it rented, what y'all knew to be the bomb. How did you then, because it didn't say Tim McVeigh on the receipt. I mean, how talk about how you go from that to Tim McVeigh.
Yeah, the law enforcement agencies, of course, knew Junction City is a hot spot. There's going to be evidence of this crime in Junction City. And so they started working their way through the hotels in the area and came across the Dreamland Hotel, which is about a mile or so distant from Elliott's body shop. And there was a woman there who had been the proprietor of this Dreamland Hotel. As I say, if you're driving from Indianapolis, where I live, to Colorado, you'll come right across Dreamland Hotel. Sits right on I-70, conveniently located. It would not get a 4-star rating.
Okay.
She said, it's a low-cost motel, but I have a great relationship with the police. I need them on occasion. And over the years, I've come to trust them, to believe in them. And so when they came to me and they said, was anybody here while recently renting a big U-Haul truck? And she knew the answer was yes. And she reached under the counter and pulled out the room registration for Timothy McVeigh. So McVeigh had rented the room at the Dreamland Hotel, used his own name to register, used Terry Nichols' address as the address, and then stayed there for a few days before he took the bomb truck and headed to Oklahoma City.
Let me take a detour real quick, because we're on the path of identifying Tim McVeigh. But let me just ask you, as a matter of criminal design, why in the world would he use Tim McVeigh, his real name, when he basically, just got done using Robert D. Kling? What do you think about that?
It's really, as a prosecutor, you probably said the same thing. You count on criminals do dumb things, and that there is no explanation, no good explanation, if you want to conceal your identity, why one shop you would use an alias, and at the hotel that you're staying at for 3 days, you would use your own name.
Yep. All
And
right.
of course, more curiously, we asked for the phone records from Leah McGowan, who was the owner. Who was he calling while he was there? And one of the calls was from McVeigh's room 25 at the Dreamland Hotel. And he called out for Chinese food. He was hungry, like Mughal Gai Pan, and ordered Chinese one night and gave the name Kling as the customer. So together he used a room rented in his own name to order food, and the alias he used to rent the bomb truck.
All right. In the process of revealing to jurors how you identified who this human was, because now you had Kling's signature, you had McVeigh name, and some suspicion that or testimony that he had this Ryder truck at the Dreamland Motel, and now Kling on the Mugu pie. I don't know if I'm even saying that right. Pan chicken, I don't know the Chinese food, but so walk us through now where you get to a human being that is Tim McVeigh.
Well, there's two things. These paths are going on very quickly. And if you stop and sort of take measurement, within 48 hours of the bomb, both McVeigh and Nichols, men who were later prosecuted and convicted for these crimes, were in custody. So that's how fast things were moving across the nation. I mean, it's a salute to our law enforcement system that all of them could do so much in short order to take those two men off the street within 48 hours of the bombing. So we really have more than two crime scenes. There's clearly downtown Oklahoma City, and frankly, there's physical evidence was very little. I mean, we would come to know from Oklahoma City the design of the bomb, the magnitude of the bomb. More than 4,000 pounds of ammonia nitrate that took down a 9-story building and killed 168 people. But the whodunit really was going to lead its way to central Kansas. Also to Arizona, Michael Fortier, and that was principally it. So in Michigan, for example, where Nichols had come from, the address that was on McVeigh's hotel registration, we seized the Rivers calling card. So that was where we found what became the means and method to explain to the jury where these two people were in the course of a year and a half of putting together both their plan and the components necessary to execute it.
Excellent. All right. So investigators find McVeigh in Noble County pulled over on a speeding or for no rear driver's license plate, no rear plate. Yep. So now we've got a man. We've got a guy to match that up. Let's talk a minute about your presentation. I know that we're skipping over some things, obviously, but you have this piece of evidence, which is the receipt that says Robert D. Kling. Judge Mage has not allowed you to use an expert to say the handwriting that says Robert D. Kling is handwriting that was made by McVeigh. So how did you go about proving to jurors that handwriting exemplar, that Robert D. Kling's signature was McVeigh's? He's the one who did.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you remind jurors more than once that over the course of time, you get familiar with other people's handwriting. I could identify my wife's, others, close family circles. It's just the experience. And that truth finds itself in the rules of evidence that allow lay testimony as to handwriting. So while we may have preferred an impressive FBI agent with credentials and background to say that man in the courtroom is the same person that authored Robert D. Kling, we weren't going to be able to do that in Judge Mage's courtroom. So we took a different route, but one that was clearly permitted by the rules of evidence, and that is to step by step demonstrate that the man named Tim Kling wrote the letters that became Robert D. Kling. We did that through a series of witnesses who would put into evidence letters that McVeigh would write. If you had sort of a route to the explosion of the volcano, you could almost trace it in the letters that McVeigh was writing the year and a half before the bombing. His increased anger towards our federal government his dedication to the belief that someone had to take a violent act against the country. And so he was putting that in his writings. So those witnesses were on the stand, and they would identify Government Exhibit 1, 2, 3 is the letter that Tim McVeigh had written to them. Many of them signing Tim, all of them familiar to the witnesses. And in the course of the trial that lasted more than 3 months, we accumulated lots of correspondence. And if you look in those letters, you'll find more than once that Tim McVeigh wrote the letter R, wrote the letter O, all the letters necessary to spell out Robert D. Kling. And so in the closing argument, the jury had seen the rental agreement. They knew all about Robert D. Kling. I simply showed them a simple exhibit. On the bottom was the known Robert D. Kling. And on the top were those letters necessary to spell out Robert D. Kling, sourced from those witnesses they had all met. And you could see the jury just start nodding during closing argument. I didn't have to say anything. They saw the evidence. It was impressive to them. It was also impressive to Stephen Jones, who shot out of his chair to object. And Judge Maitch, with a laugh, said, "No, Mr. Mackey can't proceed."
I love it. Well, I got to tell you that is such a neat way to do it, first of all, because the letters themselves, they express his motive, right? They
Yes.
serve many purposes, and one of which was to express his motive, his distrust or his hatred for the government, the idea that somebody has to do something about it. I do also, think it's interesting that if anybody had any doubts from some witnesses about their knowledge of Tim McVeigh's handwriting, you had a broad spectrum. His sister certainly was an unbiased witness who identified some of the letters, right? And then, had his buddy, last name is Nichols, Kevin Nicholas, I think was his name. I mean, again, he was somebody who knew McVeigh for a while. There wouldn't be any reason to say, that wasn't his. You had documents too that were in his car, obviously too. And that's another example of his handwriting. But I got to tell you, because you couldn't have asked Jennifer McVeigh, hey, take a look at Robert D. Kling's signature over here. Is that your brother? I mean, I think that would have been interesting. But you had to sit on that knowing that you were planting these little seeds all along. How was that for you?
Well, it's a plan, and you had to commit to it. And as it turned out, it worked. That's one. As a trial lawyer, you never ask more than a witness can deliver. And so that was the guiding principle: is be patient. Build this case one brick at a time. Make it solid, because on the other end on the other side of the wall, we thought people were going to be asked to give the death penalty. So part of our motivation in the guilt phase, of course, was build this case with such conviction, no pun intended, in every juror's mind, that they would be comfortable then doing the very difficult task of deciding what an appropriate punishment was. I remember, to your point about sort of the variety of evidence, I remember in the closing argument trying to make this point about what does proof beyond a reasonable doubt mean? Because it's a famous debate that goes on in all criminal cases, of course. And I likened it really, our case, to a Thanksgiving dinner, where everyone from the family brought in all sorts of different food items. And I said, you might like Aunt Lily's sweet potatoes more than Uncle John's, bean casserole, et cetera, et cetera. What matters is when all of you push back from the table, you're equally satisfied. And that was a way to sort of emphasize to them that we had done our best as prosecutors to bring evidence from every angle of human experience, from chemists to, tool dye experts to lay witnesses to Michael Fortier, who cased the building with Tim McVeigh, so that collectively people using at least 12 different means to evaluate evidence would be like-minded in their decision to convict.
The signature, what do I want to call that? The was it on a poster board? Did you have it? Yeah. Like how literally did you do it? I mean,
yeah, it literally was a poster board. I mean, now everything is virtual, but back in 1997 when we were trying this case, it was still old fashioned. We had poster boards, and I simply had two pieces of Velcro that concealed each of the signatures. So I would take off the bottom one, say, and you know this to be the Kling from the rental agreement. And now let's look to see what those letters in the McVeigh's letters show us.
Well, It's extraordinary and certainly powerful. And certainly if you're the defense trying to defeat the argument that that's either his handwriting or his signature, the multiple sourced approach is hard to defeat, if not impossible. That still doesn't put Tim McVeigh in Oklahoma City on the day of the bombing, right?
I'll tell you what does, though. The Oklahoma City trooper that pulled him over 76 minutes after the bomb went off.
Right.
He was the same witness that we, before trial, said, why don't you take your squad car, go park in front of the building, and drive the speed limit, and where are you 76 minutes after you take off? And his answer was right where I pulled over Tim McVeigh because he was driving an old Mercury Marquis with no license plate on the back.
Right. Well, boy, I love that piece, and you had similar evidence from driving from to Oklahoma City from Michael Fortier's house when he took McVeigh there, right? I mean,
Yep.
Or was it Terry Nichols? But it's kind of the
Terry
same
Nichols,
deal.
right.
If you left at this time, where would you be? And I would imagine, boy, juries have got to like that sort of common sense. There's no forensic testimony. It's just how far did you drive and where'd you end up?
Yeah, and when you ask, to the extent that these cases interest people because you wonder why people are making decisions they do at the time they make them. When McVeigh was pulled over, the police officer noticed a bulge in his his jacket that he was wearing, and he said two things happened at the same time. I put my gun to his head and said, you're under arrest. And turned out it was a 9mm weapon with what we call, or you would call, a cop-killing bullet in the chamber. So this is McVeigh, who's just lit a building that killed destroyed a building that killed 168 people, and he did not draw down on this police officer. So it was, and in fact, his description, the officer's description, was, he couldn't have been more polite and more cooperative, and so it's all strange. But you're right. Back to the Mercury, there was a lot of important evidence that McVeigh probably wanted to get away from.
It didn't help him. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So you have his signature. Let's talk a little bit about the calling card. You had you called some very important witnesses. You yourself, and one of them was Frederick Dexter. And this was another one too, because first of all, the people that may be listening to this, they may not know what a calling card is. They don't have those anymore. I know because I used to use them when I was in college. But basically, Frederick Dexter came in and tied a lot of stuff together. There was a morning where you had 20 or 30 witnesses come in and say, back in April, my phone number was 12345. And again, this idea of delayed gratification, this idea of planting seeds. Talk a little bit about that. Calling card.
Yeah. So I don't know how I lost the coin toss that I was responsible for the calling card, because truth be told, it was really hard. It was really hard to understand. And God bless Fred Dexter, who made it simple for me and then later for a jury, but very, very technical, just to give reliability to what ultimately we're trying to prove. And that is, these are phone numbers that help us tell who was where on certain key events. I remember when Dexter was on the stand, we took a break, and the jury was being they're doing their level best to follow this evidence and testimony. And they came back in the jury box, and Judge Maid said, "Mr. Mackey, you can proceed." And I said, "Let the record show the jury has returned to the jury box." So it was very tedious. But at the end of the day, you take that mundane necessities and you make it into something that can tell a story. And that's what we did. Was all the raw records were there, but we built summaries and maps that showed how the phone call evidence proved where these guys were. For example, to make a Texas point, it was through the calling card that we were able to determine that Nichols and McVeigh had gone to a racetrack somewhere near Dallas, Texas, as I recall.
Yeah. It is.
Hydromethane for the explosion. So that's just one illustration of how the calling card served not only in the courtroom to explain what had happened, but helped us as investigators and prosecutors piece the evidence together.
And the idea was to identify the components of the bomb and match McVeigh Nichols with procuring those components through the calling card. It was kind of like a glue that held everything together.
It really did, and it helped us identify, well, where are the storage sheds? You know, you're getting all the components, so you have ammonia nitrate being bought at different locations. You got to be stored sometime before April 19th. When we finally searched the storage units in Harrington, for example, on the floor of the storage shed was a circle left of 55-gallon drums, the same size of nitromethane they had purchased in Texas at the racetrack. So all those circumstances come to explain itself.
I think the quote from you at the beginning was, the evidence would be built brick by brick, witness by witness, a wall that added up to the guilt of Tim McVeigh. And that's kind of how you have to think of these things. The phone number is kind of a brick, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Tell us about your life, during the trial. What was that like for you? You were in Denver. You don't live in Denver, I don't think. I suppose you did for a time. But tell me just a little bit about that.
Well, there's a long story, of course, but what's most important, I think, is, you forget sometimes as a prosecutor how important your service is. But the victims of the Oklahoma City bombing never let that happen for our team. They were just absolutely amazing. They were such great friends and supporters, all sorts of examples of gifts and visits and, those things that when you're working 7 days a week for months on hand, make a difference to give you just that extra boost. A lot of us were away from our families, myself included. The second year I was out there, my family and sons came to Denver and got to ski on the weekends while I was working, and then got to come and see parts of the trial, and then obviously the outcome as well. So that provided some satisfaction to myself. But it was a challenge, of course.
Were your kids old enough to understand what was happening at that time?
Yeah. In fact, my two boys, my youngest son at the time was in the 7th grade, and a news station from Indianapolis came out to interview the Mackey family was participating in this major trial. I, of course, would not be on camera and would not be talking to reporters. That would be wrong. But the reporters came out and talked to my wife and two sons. And my youngest son, Alan, they said, well, has this been hard on you? He said, well, in some ways, I left my friends, I left my basketball team and all those things. But what I'm going through is nothing what's compared to the victims. So even at a young age, he understood the human cost and the sacrifice that comes with delivering justice in this country.
Let me take you back then to the trial. Going into it, what were you most concerned about strategically as far as proving your case? What did you think the weak links were? Or what were you concerned about? What were you worried about?
Yeah, you never do grow too confident in your proof, even though you feel like you're ready. Stephen Jones had done, I thought, a masterful job using the pretrial media to raise questions about, not in America, no American would do this. So it was always, won't the trial, the real bombers are somewhere safe in the Middle East. So you had to worry a lot about whether the biases that people have that you bring to a courtroom could be set aside. That was really the concern. And then, in terms of the death penalty phase, you always worry that jurors have, views about that would, color their views of the evidence itself. So picking a death penalty qualified jury that would be able to separate the responsibilities they had and deliver one after another was of great concern to us. And I give a lot of credit to Judge Mage, who designed a jury selection process. When we started the jury selection process, we did at the state fairgrounds in Denver, because we brought in 400 people who had answered questionnaires. And that was a process that finally, closed out itself with individual voir dire inside his courtroom. So we felt better as that process went on, that we would get fair-minded people who would honor the rules and follow the evidence.
You did have to rely in the case on accomplice testimony. Those that were accomplices, as a matter of law and I suppose a fact. But I would say that Michael Fortier was one that was a big one, probably the biggest one in the trial. Tell me about your strategies for Michael Fortier.
Yeah, the strategy, we knew that we would take criticism for not prosecuting Fortier as a conspirator. And frankly, we did everything we could to determine whether, in fact, he had ever become a member of that agreement. He was, at the end of the day, an immensely important witness for the prosecution because he could take us inside to McVeigh's mind like no other witness could. Because McVeigh had known him and trusted him, and they definitely shared a very strong anti-government sentiment. And part of the most powerful testimony from him, I thought, was when McVeigh said, "Why won't you come to Oklahoma City? What's it going to take from our government before you will act in the way McVeigh expected?" And he said, "When I see the UN trucks in my driveway." So his whole view was, I worry about the world order. There is too much government control, et cetera, et cetera. But I recognize the difference between taking innocent life and responding accordingly. And so, he told that story. And frankly, we had spent enough time with him to know that he could tell it in a credible way. And ultimately, the jury, while they may, like the victims thought, I mean, if you'd only picked up a phone, maybe these people would be alive. They set that aside and said, for whatever it's worth, he's the man who sat with McVeigh in his trailer in Arizona, and McVeigh got Campbell soup cans out and designed and showed on the floor how he was going to design the barrels in the truck so it would have maximum impact on the building when the bomb went off. So very graphic details that he provided. He's sitting with McVeigh as a case Oklahoma City murder building. They drive in one weekend late at night, and they're looking for vantage points. McVeigh is as to where he's going to place the bomb. So those are tremendously important facts to provide to a jury if they want to decide who lit the fuse and who caused the deaths.
And along the way, the little bricks count. The key was in the alley, right? That was an important part.
Yep.
I think you can see in a trial like this where an accomplice will say A, B, and C, and jurors expect if A, B, and C can be proven later on independently, they want that. And of course, the law requires it, but I'm really focused on what jurors' expectations are. So that's an important consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. And Fortier was able to help us set the stage to explain how McVeigh got away. Remember, the Mercury was staged in Oklahoma City a couple days before he returned with the bomb truck. And so Fortier talked about them looking for places to stage the getaway car.
I have always told my students and talked about how you should divide a crime up between the before, the during, and the after. And in the usual course, most cases, you have an after. There is some statement, usually given. Confession may not be the right word, but an interview. And just as well as I do that, even if they're not being truthful, if you can prove them suspect to be untruthful, that helps your case. As near as I can tell, if you wanted to call the after when McVeigh was arrested, okay, but there was no real after. There was no statements that he gave. How did that impact your presentation, if at all?
Yeah, and there's a two-part answer. One, of course, is McVeigh said nothing, but Terry Nichols went on for hours in an interview. And we could talk a little bit about the effect of that on the trial. But when we focus on McVeigh, while he said nothing, immensely important evidence came from the processing of his clothes. He wore a T-shirt He was arrested, 76 minutes after the bombing, wearing a T-shirt that had an image of Abraham Lincoln and the Latin phrase, "Thus always to tyrants," which John Wilkes Booth had yelled after shooting Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head. So that was the T-shirt that McVeigh picked on the day that he was going to blow up the Mirror building. Inside his pockets were chemical residue that linked to the bomb itself. But I thought one of the most important, impactful pieces of evidence for the prosecution was in another pocket, and it was a pair of earplugs. And so we got to talk to the jury about a man who would design this crime without regard for whether there would be man, woman, child, behind the glasses in the windows when the bomb went off. But he's taking care of his fragile eardrums. He's the guy who is both lighting the fuse and putting in his earplugs so they can escape the sound and the horror of what he had created. So those small pieces of evidence, if you want to motivate a jury to understand how evil Tim McVeigh was, those earplugs did a lot, in my judgment. But in contrast to your point about the after, Nichols saw on the news that the bomb had gone off, that it had been successful. And news was coming out that linked some of it to Kansas, to Harrington, in fact, where he was. And so he, quote, turned himself into the police, actually drove down to the Harrington police station and for the next several hours was interviewed by the FBI. He's an example of someone where you could demonstratively prove lie after lie that he told, that while recognizing that he had known McVeigh and the Army, et cetera, anything and everything that might have linked him to the bombing, of course, he denied. And so what we had was a classic example. While we would like to put that evidence on in a single trial, Judge Mage says, I'm sorry, if you want to use Nichols because he implicates McVeigh in some ways, even indirectly, you're going to have to either not use that statement or have a second trial, and thus gave birth to the two trials.
Yeah. Well, those are tough calls. I understand and appreciate that, but it does bring up a good point, about the fact that you can go back and rely on what is otherwise, some mundane circumstances, but when considered in context, become very light shedding on the guilt of the accused. The earplugs, the fact that the Redlands in the address on his driver's license didn't even exist.
Right.
I mean, that was just a totally fake thing. It didn't even matter. The birthday being April 19th. I mean, does that mean he went and did the bomb? No, but when you start accumulating these things, it becomes quite powerful.
Yeah, and one piece, for example, McVeigh recalled was at the McDonald's before he rented the truck. They had no vehicle, or he didn't. He was going to have to pick up a vehicle, so he walked from the McDonald's to Elliott's. And so we had one of the agents take that same trip, and the time difference between the timestamp on the McDonald's surveillance photo and the necessary timestamp on the rental truck was just the right amount of time to make that trip. So Piece by piece, you could put it together. Remember, there was a treasure trove of evidence at Nichols' house in Harrington. The searches recovered lots of ammonia nitrate receipts in alias names that had been used both at hotels and storage sheds. The best one, of course, was a ammonia nitrate receipt in the name of Mike Havens, one that Nichols had used a lot on motels. But it had McVeigh's fingerprint on it, and it was in Nichols' kitchen drawer. So in one piece of paper, you have a lot of important evidence that can find room for mention in the courtroom.
That's right, and that's a wonderful one too, because if you're going to at the very broadest say that somebody is involved with somebody else in committing a crime, you've got to connect the two. There was a friendship. Obviously, they knew each other for a long time, but then even the physical evidence, on that particular receipt was pretty extraordinary, to say the least. Okay, let's talk about the next thing I want to talk about, is the closing arguments. Okay, this is your opportunity now, and I mean, I've done some trials in my day. None of them lasted 3 months. All right. But now you're ready to go up and you're going to try to sum up this case. How did you approach closing arguments?
Yeah, really to, companion with the opening. Joe Hartzman and I talked a lot about making sure that we use the closing to resonate with the jury of themes and promises made in the opening statement. So that was, in broad terms, the objective is to get back to credibility, that our statements and our evidence could be trusted.
Promises made, promises kept.
Yep.
I think was one of yours. Have you ever used that before?
Never.
All original, right?
That's right.
There was one, I wanted to read something that you had mentioned, and I wanted to see if it got a reaction out of Mr. McVeigh. Do you remember what was his reaction like during the trial? What was his demeanor like? Was he pretty stoic, or?
Yeah, he was stoic. Really, it's not just through the trial, but through the entire proceedings. I remember the only time that he showed any emotion was when I think it was his father was on the stand. I think he was particularly close to his father. I got to know his father really well as well, just in the course of working the case. Just reminds you what suffering, he must go through as well. I mean, he was a simple man. I would have a beer with him after bowling. He was a good-hearted guy. But that was the only time that we saw any true human reaction from McVeigh. If you fast forward to the sentencing in federal court's no different than state court, McVeigh had an opportunity for allocution. He was going to cross-examine him. It is him and him alone. And the only thing he did was to read parts of a dissenting opinion from a U.S. Supreme Court, the theme of which is, when the government misbehaves, then the people will as well. So he literally left that courtroom with a death sentence, and his last words were "I meant it. This is what I intended to do." So I tease people later. I mean, the federal government spent millions and millions of dollars providing an extraordinary defense for Tim McVeigh, Stephen Jones, and his team. I said, went to countries I could only dream of visiting, but they were on the hunt for the real bomber. But the point of the matter is, if there was ever a case that we wanted the government and the people, and particularly the public, to have confidence in the jury verdict, it was this case. Remember that we had, from the victim standpoint, the O.J. Simpson criminal case had happened just the same summer after the bombing. And so there were a lot of victims when we started going forward, and McVeigh is the principal target, who quizzed the prosecutor saying, can we trust our jury system? Will they take the evidence and truly do what the evidence tells them to do? And so we were mindful of that throughout as well.
Do you think about the case today?
Oh, yeah, all the time. I think about individuals. There were some remarkable people that, the death penalty phase was only 3 days. And everybody in the team said it was the longest 3 days of our life. I mean, you can't imagine some of the immensely moving stories that come out of tragedies like this. I think of this one woman whose son was killed. And he's one of those people that didn't even work in the building. And was in a labor organization. Someone called, said, could you run over the court building or courthouse, federal courthouse, and pick up a document for me? That was the sole reason. I'm not sure he'd ever been in that building before, but he was there at the wrong time. And his mother testified about, if you want to know his soul, let me tell you a story, and talked about the two of them at a mall one time, and the two of them walking side by side, and she spotted a dime on the floor. She bent over and started to pick it up, and her son admonished her and said, no, don't do that. To you and me, it's 10 cents, but to a little kid, it's a treasure. And, there were 3 days of stories like that made it impossible really to understand the total cost. So yeah, I do. I think about them a lot.
What do you think about, are there any parallels between Timothy McVeigh in 1995 or 7 and what's happening now in our country?
Well, I think so. I mean, McVeigh was tapped into, this white hot intensity hatred towards the federal government, and there's a string of that still. I mean, one of the suspicions, of course, was McVeigh operating for the militia, or the militia version back in 1995, and that's something that we scoured up and down and sideways, and ultimately decided he really was acting entirely alone. But I worry about the same combination that McVeigh represented. Him. He once was a soldier who represented this country.
Very good.
Was a very good soldier and was rewarded. But we trained him. He wasn't a novice when he went out into the desert to start making test bombs. This was a skill that he had come to know. When you combine that background with that kind of mindset, you could lead to radically sad events like he created.
Well, Mr. Mackey, I really do appreciate your time. Is there anything else that are lessons that could be drawn from this, or just really anything else that you want to share with us?
Yeah, it's, for lawyers, it's, you ask yourself sometimes, is this the right profession? How important is it? And we get lost sometimes in our own daily worlds about whether that's the right path. And if you want to be reassured, that this country has the system of justice, unlike any others, that can deliver justice, consider this case, because that's exactly what it did.
Thank you once again to Mr. Mackey for sharing his time and talents with us. Currently, Mr. Mackey advises on white-collar criminal defense and complex litigation as a partner at Barnes & Thornburg, LLP in Indianapolis. On the next episode of A Murderous Design, we'll sit down with the man Racehorse Haynes recommended to Stephen Jones to try the case, Houston lawyer Christopher Tritico. I'm Brandon Birmingham. Thank you for joining us, and please visit amurderousdesign.com for some fascinating materials on this trial.